Exactly.
Well, did your mother like the Arthurian legend?
Oh, totally. She told me these stories first. Yeah, absolutely. And she told them. She was an amazingly, she's a very intelligent and very widely read woman. And I realized afterwards when I came to university and picked up Mallory for the first time myself and began to read, in high Middle English, what Caxton had printed, that there were whole passages in there that my mother had been more or less quoting. I mean, But she didn't give me a kind of sanitized version of it, So, I mean, the thing that was most memorable for me, I mean, I was her account of the dolorous stroke and the coming of the wasteland, which you often don't get told at all.
Right.
And it's the only thing that makes sense of the grail. The grail is to heal the king, and in healing the king, to heal the land.
Right.
And I remember being, shocked when she told me the story of how Balin rashly, even though the voices are telling him, come no further, man of blood, and he finds his way into the Holy of Holies, and he's in fear, he's being pursued by perilous, he's looking for a weapon, and, he sees the spear of Longinus hanging in the air above the grail, and the drops of blood falling, and he's, oh, Mum, no, don't tell me what it is. And of course he rushes forward and seizes it, and at that moment, as he wounds the Fisher King, the whole land is laid waste. And I'm going, but Mum, he didn't know.
Right.
So I remember being really, so she was really full about the whole, when they lie 3 days and 3 nights, under with Balin and the king he's wounded, and the grail itself and the spear, and then on the 3rd day, Merlin comes and moves the stones, and Merlin tells him that because he's done this is the dolorous blow, he's brought this wasteland about. I remember stopping Mum and said, but Mum, that's how could there even be a world where one rash man does this thing? And what about all the people, she was telling me the crops died in the field and the fish floated up on the river, and the cows couldn't bear calves and people couldn't bear children, and, it was completely... So, how could, there be a world where that could even happen? And at that point, I was about 8, this is 64, maybe, 65. And my mother looks at me and says, well, I'm telling you this story, Malcolm, because you need to know you live in just such a perilous world.
Wow.
And this was just after the Cuban Missile Crisis and the fears of a nuclear winter, and, so... Oh my goodness, but then she says, she said, I mean, it's amazing. It's just really strange if you're a kid and you think about your origins. And, she says, your father and I had to really talk and pray together, and to think, is it right to bring children into such a world? And but we did so in hope. And then she goes back to the story and she says, after all these devastating things that Merlin tells Balin about what he's done, and that he's going to have to ride for 3 days and everybody's going to come to their doors and curse him because he did this. She says, but he did not ride on without hope because, and then she tells me this bit of the story, because Merlin said to him, one day the Grail Knight will come and he will undo what you've done. Where you came rashly and with a spirit of vengeance, he will come reverently into the chapel. Where you ignored the Grail, he will celebrate it for what it is. And then he will, with the very same spear with which you wounded the king and laid the land, he will take that, and because it is the blood of Christ on the spear, drops from the spear that wounded him will heal him. And when the Fisher King is healed, the land will be healed. So he knows that before he goes out. I mean, you can imagine, I'm 8. But obviously I didn't forget it. I'm telling you about it now. But one of the things I learned there was that this story knows things that I don't know. However long ago it was written, it already knows about what we were facing there. And later, when I was looking at the ecological, at the wasteland, and then finally, as an academic, when I was looking at the whole problem of disenchantment, the whole problem of this reductivism. I mean, Lewis was once asked, what's the sum of all you write about? He says it's against reductivism. That is a kind of wasteland. That we've been living in a moral and intellectual wasteland, and that, again, that needs healing. And this story is about, but, finally, of course, eventually I returned to my Christian faith as a young man. I mean, having lost it for a while. when I came back to that, I became aware. I was reading, Milton, this time as a believer rather than merely as a student. And, you think Paradise Lost, it's a plot giveaway in the two. Yeah. But, you don't get to the moment of Eve reaching for the apple until book 9. But when she does, so saying you and Eve in evil hour with rash hand reached it, he doesn't say, like the first thing at that moment of the fall of mankind, he doesn't say, and so this individual woman committed a peccadillo and it'll be all right with therapy. I mean, what he actually, what he actually says, the very first thing he says is, earth felt the wound, and nature sighing out through all her works gave sign that all was lost. So I grasped that this isn't just a private story of humanity, this is a cosmic story. And of course, later on, I came to read Romans more seriously, and I realized, that the creation was subjected to futility, but in hope, and the whole creation waits with eager longing. And oh my God, this is the wasteland story. And of course, the professors, when I was studying this in the 70s, were all saying, this is really pre-Christian pagan stuff, and it's just been given a light Christian gloss, but we can remove that, Well, I mean, probably there are fertility rituals and kings wedded to land, and there's the idea of the dying king and the rising king certainly speaks about winter and spring. But then winter and spring speak about that for a reason, because so I began to realize that these stories were taking the old things, bringing them to the light of Christ, and they were suddenly finding their fulfillment. Mm-hmm. And then I looked around at who's telling the story now, and all of that is absent. So that made me think, okay, like maybe my mother prepared me for this. Like maybe I'm the guy that, and I didn't see myself as giving a personal interpretation, or I'm restoring something. Right. I'm taking all the, I'm painting back in what was deliberately painted out over the last couple of 100 years and saying, now look at it.
Well, and I'm glad you dedicated it to her.
Oh, yeah.
Because if you hadn't right now, I'd say you should have dedicated it.
She would too.
Yeah.